Welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Michelle Gold, Board Chair at Holocaust Museum LA, the first Holocaust museum in the United States, founded in 1961 by survivors who wanted to create a safe space to display their precious artifacts, to remember their family members and loved ones who had perished, and to educate future generations on the important lessons of the Holocaust. The museum is open 7 days a week, and admission is always free to all Californian residents and students, fulfilling the mission of our founders to commemorate, educate, and to inspire. Thank you once again for joining us for today's program, A Homegrown Threat, Antisemitism, White Supremacy, and Domestic Terrorism in the United States. In 2021, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Homeland Security reported that deadly attacks by racially motivated violent extremists are on the rise. FBI Director Christopher Wray testified before Congress that violent extremists motivated by white supremacy represent a significant domestic terrorism threat to the United States. Today, we are so privileged to be joined by Dr. Erroll Southers, Director of Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies and the Safe Communities Institute at USC's Sol Price School of Public Policy. Dr. Southers will discuss with us the growing and interconnected threats of anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and domestic terrorism in the United States. With anti-Semitism on the rise both locally in Los Angeles and across the nation and abroad, it is important, more important than ever, to have these discussions. And we so appreciate having Dr. Southers here with us today to share his expertise and experience. There will be some time at the end of the program for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, do so by typing it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. It is now my pleasure and indeed my privilege to introduce Dr. Erroll Southers. Dr. Southers, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thank you. My first question for you, Dr. Southers, is can you take us through your career path from police officer to academia? And would you share with us how your career in law enforcement influenced your decision to study homegrown violent extremism?
Well, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. And again, thank you for having me. I have the honor and privilege of having served in 3 law enforcement agencies. So I started my career 41 years ago, I'm going to date myself here, at the Santa Monica Police Department. And I ended my uniform career at the Los Angeles World Airports Police Department as assistant chief. And in between, I was in the FBI, where I was on the foreign counterintelligence and terrorism squads, as well as a member of SWAT. Quite honestly, I grew up in New Jersey and as a young man of color and had some interactions with the police that weren't always positive, and fortunately never got in any trouble, but was often stopped. And I would complain and whine to my parents. And I'll never forget one day after I was complaining to my dad about the police stopping me for no reason, he said, you know, Erroll, you can't change the castle from outside the moat. And so here I am. I became a law enforcement officer, a police officer, an FBI agent, because I wanted to be the change that I wanted to see in those agencies. I've had a really incredible career and as you know, I teach at USC, and a majority of my students, they're all graduate students, and most of them are in public policy or public administration. I would not be here were it not for public service. I was appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger to serve in the Office of Homeland Security in the governor's office, where I was the deputy director in charge of critical infrastructure protection. That's slang for identifying, prioritizing, and protecting all the terrorist targets in the state of California. We have the largest data set, twice the size of the closest second place runner is Texas in the country. So that was quite an undertaking. And I was also President Obama's first nominee to head the TSA. So I've been at USC now for 18 years. My dissertation was on homegrown violent extremism. I got interested in it quite a while ago, and I'll tell you a quick story. When I was a member of SWAT in the FBI, I was coming from training one day, and I was in San Diego County, and I'm sitting at a traffic light. And obviously, if I'm coming from SWAT training, we were on the range that day. I have a small gun shop in my car, and two guys pulled up next to me, and their windows were up, my windows were up, and I could tell they were saying some pretty obscene things. They were yelling at me, trying to get my attention, giving me the finger. And I'm just sitting there looking straight ahead saying, guys, it's got to be the longest light in San Diego. And then as that light turned green, the passenger rolled down the window and leaned out and said, Heil Hitler. I was near Fallbrook. It was the 1980s. Tom Metzger was still in charge of the White Aryan Resistance there. And we had an investigation open into his activities. So it just goes to show you how close the threat can be when you think of those things being so long ago and so far away. And so that really inspired me to stay, as I've covered and studied terrorism throughout most of my career. And we'll talk about this. You know, I've spent over 15 years in Israel, where I also teach, and France, where I also teach. I've spent the time focusing on the homegrown threat because most of these attacks that occur around the world, although they might be influenced by a foreign terrorist organization, the attackers are often from right next door and born there. And so we'll talk about that. So that's kind of guided my path. I've had some great mentors and colleagues along the way. And I hope I've been part of the contribution to the solution in protecting and preserving the security of our nation.
Thank you. And as we reflect back 25 years ago on the Oklahoma City bombings in 1995, we remember the victims and we remember their families. The horrific attack, often referred to as one of the worst homegrown terrorism cases in the nation's history. My question to you is, what are some of the characteristics of homegrown violent extremism? And how did this shape the FBI's approach?
Boy, oh boy, when you go back to 1995 and Timothy McVeigh, he was part of a growing anti-government movement in the United States. As you know, he was a veteran. It's a long story about how he got that way, but on his path to radicalization, quote unquote, he connected with a number of Christian identity movements across the country at the time. He happened to be at Waco when the FBI had the encounter, or I should say the shootout with the Branch Davidians there. When the FBI stormed the compound and it was on fire, McVeigh vowed to get revenge because he felt that his country had killed women and children unnecessarily. And so as we've evolved now over the last 20, 30 years, the threat has changed from one that was motivated in some instances, in that case, by what we call an issue-oriented ideology, to basically three streams. We have that driven by race, and as you mentioned previously, when Director Wray testified, he talked about racial violent extremists. That driven by religion, and as you know, around 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, we focused largely on jihadists, and those being motivated by Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab and ISIS. And those, lastly, as I just mentioned, issue-oriented groups. The problem and challenge is, Michelle, that today we find that violent extremists are almost like people sitting in a restaurant looking at a menu, and they check off all the boxes that work for them. And sometimes you would think that they're counterintuitive with regards to what they decide to adhere to, but there is no profile. That's the only thing I can tell you. There is no profile today. And these extremists are all races, religions, ethnicities, nationalities, both genders, and very dangerous.
An FBI director testified in Congress that violent extremists motivated by white supremacy represents a significant domestic terrorism threat to the United States. And yet, the United States has rarely designated any domestic or international group motivated by white supremacy, white nationalism, or neo-Nazi ideology as a terrorist organization. What dangers does this pose? And how does this impact law enforcement's ability to protect against attacks from such groups?
That's a great question, Michelle. We live and we have lived in a state of denial for quite some time. The statistics are overwhelming. When Director Wray was testifying, he's talking about the last decade, largely from 2010 to 2019, where 76% of the attacks in this country were perpetrated by right-wing extremists. If you look at shootouts with police officers in that same time frame, 83% of the shootouts with law enforcement were by right-wing extremists. And so here we are. We have a saying at my center by a famous data scientist named W. Edwards Deming. We say, without data, you're just someone with an opinion. And so the reason I'm giving you all these numbers is because the data has been overwhelming, and we would think that data would influence policy. Well, it hasn't. We've been running on fear. And even though we had what happened in 1995 at the Murrah building with anti-government extremists, we took our eye off the ball when 2001 happened and we had 9/11. It gave us a foreign threat. We lived in a world of what I called otherism. We were always looking for another religion, another ethnicity, another nationality, never believing that Americans would kill Americans driven by an extremist ideology. And so the danger, to your question, the danger is, as we have taken our eye off the ball as a country in terms of our homeland security and our national security, we have events like the ones we just had on January 6th. That is something that my colleagues and I have seen coming and have been warning about that for well over a decade. We never thought it would be that severe. We never thought it would be the United States Capitol, but we were wrong. And so here we are. And even now, as I'm sitting here with you, watching broadcasts today of people denying that it's taken place because we don't want to believe that we could, if we were another country looking from afar at what happened to us, we would certainly call what happened here an insurrection if we didn't call it a coup attempt. And that's where we are today.
And Dr. Southers, almost 4 years ago in 2017, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville ended in tragedy. It was a significant moment in revealing hatred and blatant discrimination, and spurred anti-Semitic and racist incidences across the country. And today in the US, we are experiencing a new wave of a rise of anti-Semitism. I think we're all aware of this. It includes Los Angeles, it includes San Francisco. And just recently, 5 days ago, it was reported that a rabbi in Boston was stabbed multiple times outside a Jewish day school. So my question to you is, what progress have we made on this issue since 2017? Or are we caught in a vicious cycle here?
We have made some progress, but unfortunately, I don't know if we are ahead or taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So let's go back to 2017. That was a game-changing moment in domestic violent extremism in the United States, and I'll tell you why. The Unite the Right rally, of course, was organized in response to the efforts to remove a Confederate statue in Charlottesville. And what's interesting about that, Michelle, is that we had a whole collection of right-wing extremist organizations, white supremacists, groups like Patriot Front, the Klan, Vanguard, groups that typically do not work together, collaborate, communicate. They decided under the umbrella of protecting the white race and protecting, most importantly, the Confederacy, they would all go to that rally. And we knew it was going to be a problem. I happened to be in New Orleans 3 days before at a convention with Bill Whitaker from 60 Minutes. I was on a panel, and I will never forget telling him, in 3 days, you're going to see the largest rally by the right wing in this country in a decade. I hope we can have that day end with no one getting killed. And Heather Heyer, of course, was killed when James Fields ran over her with his car. Today, where are we? Let me tell you where we are today. I work very closely with our colleagues here at the ADL, and if any of them are joining us today, again, thank you for all your work. Their Extremism Center is outstanding. I work really closely with Joanna Mendelson and Ariella Lowenstein. They're on our faculty at the Safe Communities Institute as well. But if we look at 2021, 63% of the Jews polled this year have experienced or heard anti-Semitic comments, slurs, or threats targeting other people. A third of them, 36%, reported online harassment and what's called Zoom bombing if you're on Zoom calls. You got 50% of the Jews surveyed are afraid of a violent attack at a synagogue. Now, my center puts on a talk called Homegrown Violent Extremism and Protecting House of Worship. Prior to COVID, we had more requests for that talk in those months than I have ever had in my career. I've spent more time in churches and synagogues in the last 2 years than in the previous 20. And most importantly, 60% of the respondents to that survey feel less safe as Jews in the United States than they did a decade ago. So when you ask me, are we making progress? We might be making progress with regards to thwarting attacks. We're certainly not making progress in the minds of many people as they think about their personal safety and their concerns and fears that they have.
And we talk of great concerns, and of course, of great concern is social media, isn't it? The computer has allowed racists and anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers and white supremacists to become more efficient, haven't they? Unchallenged and unfiltered. And how do you view this?
Well, I'll tell you, anybody today who has a keyboard, unfortunately, has a voice and has an opinion. What's really challenging about that is the ability for people to connect. If you have an idea, I call it groupthink, you can go online and find 1,000 people in 10 minutes that absolutely agree with what it is, even if you think the world is flat. And so it's very dangerous. And with an increasing population that doesn't absorb any news from vetted sources, getting their news from social media, getting their news from networks that lean left or right, make it even more problematic. What's even more challenging are the attackers that are involved in attacking houses of worship. We'll talk about that for a moment. They now understand the importance of that, and they're posting manifestos on these networks, usually using the dark web or Tor as it's called. And we found that, for example, the Tree of Life attacker in 2018, he posted to Gab. A year later in New Zealand, that attacker posted his manifesto on 8chan. And then the Chabad attack in Poway in San Diego, he posted his on Pastebin. And we've even seen in 2 instances with the New Zealand attacker, and I believe it was an attacker who attacked a synagogue in Berlin. They tried to live stream the attack.
Yeah.
And so you can see where social media and technology has taken on a whole new usefulness to both communication and attack operations in this space. And it makes it even more challenging, especially in the United States, where we have a First Amendment privilege where hate speech is actually protected, which makes it very difficult. You're from London, and you know, if you engage in hate speech in public in London, you'll be silenced. You'll be removed. You'll not be able to do that. Unfortunately, here, you'll be protected. And it's really challenging to secure and protect a democracy when you've got a First Amendment privilege like that and people exercise it at their own will.
And in mentioning London as a British expat myself, the anti-Semitism which has evolved there is rampant. As it is in France and as it is in Spain and Italy, and it's I call it a slippery slope. It's very worrisome, very, very worrisome indeed.
It is very worrisome. I teach at the University of Paris, and when I was there 2 years ago, 15,000 Parisian Jews left France to move to Israel, a country they had never lived in, because they were so fearful. They stopped wearing Star of David, stopped wearing a kippah. I mean, they just left because they did not feel safe there. So that just really illustrates the level of fear and concern that people have going about their daily lives.
Absolutely. Dr. Southers, there's also been a recent rise in racially motivated attacks on members of the AAPI and Black communities. What can you tell us about where these attacks are coming from and how they relate to the rise of anti-Semitic attacks?
Well, Michelle, you ask a very, very good question, and there is a nexus. When we went into COVID stay-at-home orders in March of 2020, the Asian American Pacific Island community started tracking COVID-19 related hate attacks across the country. Our center started posting under the hashtag Virus of Hate along with the Shaw Foundation at USC, so people would be aware of this. In the first week, they had 670 attacks that were reported in 1 week in the country. By the second week, they had 1,150. What's really startling and scary about that is 1/3 of the attacks happened in the state of California. What's interesting is that the FBI Washington field office in that month of March in 2020 put out a bulletin that warned people about attacks that would be related to COVID-19, specifically warning the Jewish and Asian American Pacific Islander communities, saying that you would be targeted under the guise of some of these groups they had been following. In fact, they had noted that neo-Nazis and white supremacists were telling their followers, if you get infected, try to spread COVID to Jews and to police officers, interestingly enough. In that same month in March, they arrested a 36-year-old, I call him a 36-year-old extremist trifecta. He was a racially, religious, issue-oriented attacker who was going to blow up a hospital in Kansas because it was treating COVID patients. What we've seen since then is the Asian American Pacific Islander community has been targeted largely at big box retail stores, at pharmacies, at grocery stores. People have been spraying disinfectant on them. They've been attacked on rail stations. I have a presentation where I show a slide of the LA Metro and the New York subway in the same 24-hour period where Asian Americans were attacked on the train the same day. And so we've been advising people to go out in groups. If you see this thing start to evolve, walk away from it. If you're witnessing it, sometimes if you get closer to the victim, these attackers, the cowards that they are, they will typically leave. It got so bad, Michelle, that the Asian American Pacific Islander community, in some instances, were advising their colleagues to wear a baseball cap with a GoPro camera on it so you could video record the incident if you got victimized. Just think about that. They're walking out anticipating becoming a victim and having to have it on camera. And the numbers I shared you, keep in mind, hate crimes are grossly underreported. And unfortunately, when they are reported to law enforcement agencies, the law enforcement agency may take it as an assault, but never make the connection to the fact that it's a hate crime, if it is or if it isn't. And so we have no idea what the real numbers are. This is a growing problem. And as we now start to, I'll call it repopulate, because we've dropped or reduced some of the COVID restrictions, I would anticipate you'll see this even more now due to the frustration of people who don't want to wear a mask when they go inside somewhere, don't want to be told what to do. And it's been an ongoing problem now for over a year, but it specifically plagues the Jewish and Asian American Pacific Islander communities.
Dr. Southers, considering your recent work focusing on police misconduct, is white supremacy and anti-Semitism in law enforcement a concern that you hope the law enforcement work inquiry system will help address?
It is a concern. And again, as someone who's a veteran of 3 law enforcement agencies, I'll say this. As law enforcement is no different than any other occupation. As long as we recruit from the human race, you're going to have people who are anti-Semitic. You're going to have people who are racist. We have to do a better job of screening. We have to do a better job of recruiting. But we have to do a better job of when people do get fired, for whatever reason, that when they get fired, they don't return to that profession. So the banner you see behind me is an initiative that we've organized in our Safe Communities Institute. We just had an announcement last month, and it's the Lewis Registry, named after Representative John Lewis. And the LEWIS acronym stands for the Law Enforcement Work Inquiry System. It is a comprehensive national database that's documenting officers who have been fired or resigned in lieu of misconduct. We have had tremendous support from this, from community organizations to law enforcement. In fact, we just did a survey of law enforcement, 360 chiefs across the country. 74% said they support the registry. When we asked them in our second question, if you would use the registry if it was available for your screening process, 95% said yes. The other thing I'd mention too, we have bipartisan support for this effort. We have 80% support across all three political parties for the LEWIS registry. I will say this, having been attached to this profession for over 40 years, in the chiefs I've spoken to across the country, they all agree, none of us want people like that working for us, and the communities that we serve don't deserve people working in those communities like that. And so we're trying to be part of that solution, that we can help screen, we can help get the best people into law enforcement. I would not be here today were it not for being in law enforcement, and I do believe it's a noble profession. I think we can find the right people, but I do think we have to be concerned. By the way, Michelle, I just gave 2 lectures in the last 2 months to the United States Air Force. They also have a concern in our armed forces about extremists as well. And as you know, Secretary Austin, who's the Secretary of Defense, had a stand down over the last month. So I was part of that effort to educate them on what it is, what it looks like, and what they can do about it.
And referring to education, I'm going to now turn to addressing Holocaust education. Why is Holocaust education so important in the fight against anti-Semitism and racism and white supremacy?
It is so important because I get, and I'm kind of shifting around right now, because it is unconscionable that people believe that it didn't happen. And I just, to me, it's almost like talking to someone who would tell you the world is flat. I think that people have to understand what the Holocaust was, what it meant, how it happened. I remind people often that Adolf Hitler was elected. I remind people often of the activities that he went through in the process of gathering support. I have been through the Museum of Tolerance several times. I often encourage my colleagues, especially in law enforcement, to go to the Museum of Tolerance. I had a colleague who was the Director of Security at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. It is very important that we understand our past. This is not to vilify anyone or make them responsible for it, but it is very important to understand this, if for no other reason, so this doesn't happen again. And I used to be of the belief that there were certain things that happened historically that couldn't repeat themselves. I don't feel that way anymore, not after the past couple of years. We have to be very, very careful about our democracy. We have to be very, very careful about the education. And I'm concerned that there are many historical facts, both here in the country and globally, that young people are not learning, that they must learn. And if we're going to have a democracy continue here and other places, so they understand how we got here. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and they really need to understand how we got to where we are today.
Thank you for that response. And my personal view is that good Holocaust education is the most effective way and the best tool we have to combat racism and anti-Semitism in all its forms. Actually, Holocaust Museum LA participated in a program run by the Anti-Defamation League to educate, which I'm sure you're aware of, to educate local law enforcement agencies about the role that the police in Nazi Germany played in the Holocaust. And I'm proud that I was actually one of the docents that had the privilege of leading local law enforcement participants through the galleries in the museum. So how do you think Holocaust education benefits the law enforcement agencies that have taken our course at Holocaust museums? And how can Holocaust education institutions and law enforcement agencies work together to affect change in their communities and their own individual communities?
Well, I think Holocaust education is extremely important for law enforcement, but I think Holocaust education is extremely important for everybody. I think it's important that people understand, as you mentioned previously, what happened and how it came to be. And especially if you're going to be in law enforcement, you're going to serve a very diverse community here in the United States. It's important to understand religion and how those religions have survived through the years. I mean, we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about the Jewish community, and we talk about the 60s and the burning of Black churches, and it's as important for African Americans to know.
Absolutely.
So I think it's critical. I have to tell you, Michelle, that we did a study years ago, and I hate to say this, but the growing distrust in the government seems to be increasing every year. But I will say this, most people believe they're faith-based leaders. And one of the efforts we worked on with the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at USC years ago is we decided, we worked with FEMA to put together an app that addressed the eight largest religious communities in the country with the traditions and cultures of that religion for first responders, so they would know how to appropriately interact with people when you're trying to tell them there might be a disaster coming. If the mayor says you have to pack up and evacuate, most people say, yeah, sure. If the rabbi, the priest, the pastor, or the imam says you have to pack up and leave, people are gone. And we get that. And so I think the faith-based community is important. And I think it's really important that public safety and first responders have a better than average knowledge of the faith-based communities that they serve.
I think that is such a wise thing you've just said. I totally agree with you. I'm going to now look at some of the Q&A that we have and see what we have here. I have a question for you from Victoria Olson, who asks, why aren't the people and groups who attracted the capital why are they not being charged as domestic terrorists? And the second part of this question is, am I correct that when domestic horrors happen as a group shooting, they are not labeled legally as terrorists? Why is that?
Fantastic questions.
Yeah.
Welcome to the American legal system. So for many years, as you know, we had no problems, and nor do we still have any problems when we are able to attach an attacker to a foreign terrorist organization or ideology. We will label them terrorists automatically. I will say this, we don't need new laws. There are over 50 laws in the United States Code, Title 18, that can be used for terrorism, domestic terrorism. The challenge is kind of threefold. Number one, there is no common definition of terrorism in the United States. I often challenge my students with this. I will say to them, go to every agency you can think of in the country that's responsible for terrorism, and let me know when you find two that have the same definition. This is not a United States problem, by the way. This is a global problem. My colleague and my mentor at IDC in Herzliya, Dr. Boaz Ganor, we were threatening to get together as an international coalition to go to the UN and say, let's agree on a definition. So that's part of the problem. The other problem is one, as I mentioned previously, is one of denial. Terrorist is a very pejorative term. So you'll often hear people talk about mass shootings. You'll hear somebody called an attacker. They may pivot to mental illness, but they never want to say that the person was a terrorist. And there's a reason for that, because again, we're still in that American denial of we don't do things like that, when in fact, we're no different than any of our colleagues and our allies all over the world. So part of the reason is legal. Part of the reason I think is political. And so to answer her question about January 6th, look, it checks all the boxes for me. And there's three boxes. You have to have the threat or use of violence. We got that. You've got to have civilians being targeted. Well, for the definition's purpose, law enforcement includes civilians. When I say civilians, I mean non-military personnel. And the last is it has to be politically motivated by either race, religion, or issue orientation. Well, anti-government is an issue-oriented extremist ideology. We're checking all three boxes. We fit the definition of terrorism. There are others who will say, we fit the definition of an insurgency, or I should say an insurrection. So again, there's a lot of politics at play. I will say this, the good news is that those 500 people that have already been arrested by the FBI, they will be charged federally. And no one wants to have a criminal history at all, but you definitely don't want to have a criminal history where you've been arrested and charged federally. That will never go away. And that's getting a lot of attention. And if you've been following this, you'll notice quite a few people have decided to cooperate with the authorities as it relates to identifying other people, and also as it relates to the possibilities of conspiracies or planning or operations that were in place on January 6th. So this is a long way from over, and it's going to get quite interesting. Thank you for the question. Great question.
And one of our listeners has said, Dr. Southers, can you include corrections in Lewis?
Corrections? Oh, corrections. Oh, corrections. You know, thank you. I'm sorry. I thought as in it was misspelled. No, corrections. I'll tell you why. That's a great question. We've had that question. We've been asked to include corrections. We've been asked to include probation. We've been asked to include former military. So here's what we're going to do. Right now, we're going to include law enforcement only. And I want to be very specific here. All of our information is coming from open source, publicly available sources. So we're not compromising any officer or former officer's safety or the safety of his family. Anytime an officer is reinstated, by the way, and 23% of the officers in America fired are reinstated, we take them out of the registry. But that's a great question. We may get there someday with corrections, probation, and military, but for now, we're focused on law enforcement. It's a heavy lift right now, but I thank you for the recommendation, because you're not the first person who said that, and obviously others have thought of it. So thank you. We may go down that road someday, but we're not there yet. So I appreciate your support.
Thank you. The next question for you. In light of Hitler being elected as an official, do you believe the possible re-election of Donald Trump will strengthen white supremacy? If not Trump, who else is a direct threat to our safety?
I don't know that Donald Trump has to be re-elected to be a threat. He's a threat now. There are people who believe he's going to be reinstalled next month. So he has certainly galvanized the movement. He said a lot of things that people were thinking. He made it okay to say those things out loud. Who do I think is the biggest threat? I'm not going to give anyone the notoriety today of identifying an individual or a group. I will say this, though. He has certainly changed the game. And we've seen similar leaders in autocracies across the country that have come to power the same way. And this is a very, very dangerous time in our country, that we're this divided. I never thought we would ever be this divided. And I've gone through 2 sets of riots as a kid in the 60s, the civil rights movement, almost, I won't say pale by comparison, but never thought that I'd be having these kinds of concerns or discussions as an adult, nor did I ever think this would be my profession growing up, because I always felt like, wow, we've taken care of that. I mean, I take great pride in the fact that, you know, I was bused as a kid across town. I went to an all-white school, and I went to more bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs than I can tell you about. And that's how we grew up. I mean, we just all grew up together. And here we are now. We live in this zero-sum world of, if you're not for me, you're against me. And it's very disturbing and very concerning. And we do have a lot of work to do going forward. And I think the best thing we can do is educate people and make them aware of how serious this is.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. My next question for you is, one of our listeners is saying she has a comment for you and a question for you. Many young people today have heard of the Holocaust. Also, there are Holocaust minimizers in addition to the deniers. The question is, do you believe that the First Amendment rights should not be protected? She understands what you judge, who is just expressing their opinion on what is actually hate speech.
Well, I think the First Amendment right has to be protected. I personally draw the line at hate speech for obvious reasons. But then again, what is hate speech to me to someone else might not be hate speech? That's a great question. And I'm not trying to dodge the question with my answer. I'm just saying that I think that intelligent, reasonable people can agree to disagree without being hateful. And I would think that when this country was founded, that the First Amendment did not include any of the activities that we have today. And so that's also part of the challenge. So I do think the First Amendment has to be retained. I think we just have to learn to be adults and learn to be civil. My students in class, they can say anything that they can back up with data and facts and remain civil. And so that's where I do agree. We have to have a First Amendment. There's a way to do it. I don't think we should think about removing it, but I have no problem, however, with the way some other countries address hate speech in the public sphere. And I don't think the United States will ever get there. But I do appreciate and acknowledge the way that other countries have decided that hate speech is not going to be allowed.
Thank you. And do you think, from another audience member today, do you think that January 6th will be seen as a pivotal event for recruitment for extremist organizations, just like Charlottesville was?
That is a fantastic question. Thank you, whoever sent it in. Let me just tell you, January 6th will always be remembered. It was called Independence Day before it happened by the groups that were going to be there. It has become a force multiplier. To the people who participated, January 6th was a success. They breached the Capitol. And as someone who was responsible for the protection of America's critical infrastructure during 2 presidents, I can tell you that there are a couple of places that I can name on one hand that I thought were impenetrable. And the Capitol will be near the top of that list. The fact that mostly untrained mob breached that building with the people that we know who were in it at the time is beyond frightening. And they know it. So this is not going to go away. I'm as concerned about the anniversary as I was concerned about the anniversary of the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. And they tried to have a repeat the year later. And if you remember, the Virginia governor decided we're not going to have that. And the city of Charlottesville said we're not going to have that. So they rallied in front of the White House that year. But no, it is being seen as a success. It is a huge recruitment tool online. And these groups are rallying. And if you're reading any of the FBI bulletins that are coming out now, they are very concerned about a similar event, not just happening there, but happening elsewhere across the country because of the way they've been able to recruit and radicalize on that event happening.
What can you tell us about Americans who go overseas to get military training with white nationalist groups in places like the Ukraine?
Ooh, that's a great question. It's funny, whoever asked that question, great one. I always think of the base. So for those of you who know Arabic, you know that Al-Qaeda translates into the base, into English. We have a group called the base here. They're also connected to an Atomwaffen division of neo-Nazis in Europe. They are transnational. They have set up paramilitary training facilities across this country. And to the point of the question, yes, they've been training overseas. We have other groups here. I'm not going to give them any fame or notoriety today, but we have a South Bay group, I'll just say in cities that are typically known for surfing. These guys are a modern day fight club, and they too have trained overseas. What's interesting about them is that this particular group, most of them are convicted felons. They're all young 20-somethings who are in mixed martial arts, and they have been training overseas. But I will say this to the person who asked the question, they are definitely on the radar screen of the national security organizations and authorities that should know. When they come back here, some of them have been arrested. We're tracking their activities. It's really interesting, again, whoever asked the question, the difference between, let me pivot for a second. The difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS was that Al-Qaeda was largely covert. You didn't know who was in it, how to get to it, how to join, what you would do when you got overseas. ISIS flipped the script. ISIS had a website. They told you how to get to Turkey, where to buy uniforms, what you would do when you got there, who got paid. We're seeing these American groups and these European groups do the same thing now. They have websites. They're vetting people in. They're having meetups in person. They're training in the field. And now they're training overseas. So it's interesting how they mirrored that successful business model that ISIS had into a business model now for the right wing, and it's working.
Why do the violent opponents of Antifa get labeled as fascists, which is one of the questions we've been asked?
Well, you know, it's interesting. And I always explain it this way. You know, some people in Antifa call themselves Antifa, some call themselves anti-fascists. And you know, the anti-fascist movement goes back to the 1920s. It's nothing new. It evolved, if you will, during the Trump administration, where they became an anti-Trump, anti-alt-right movement. I'll tell you why. Because anti-fascism is an ideology. And so the reason they're not called a group or organization, as when Director Wray testified in front of the Senate, they're an ideology. It'd be sort of like someone saying, I'm a member of white supremacy. Well, white supremacy is not a group. It's an ideology. Same with anti-fascists. They're not a group, they're an ideology. Even though they'll call themselves Antifa, they've got flags, it's easy for us to identify, but I always want to make that distinction. And understand this, in my world, those people who belong to the anti-fascist movement are homegrown violent extremists. I mean, they are out there, they are largely anti-government, they are largely anti-law enforcement. They go there to fight with the right-wing extremists. They've given a couple of campuses a black eye, if you will, when Berkeley had the mini riot a couple of years ago, when one of the right-wing speakers was going to be there and the campus was torn apart. Those weren't Berkeley students. Those were people who identify with the anti-fascist movement. So, you know, it's interesting about labels. Again, you don't want to call people terrorists because it's pejorative. But I do call a duck, and the anti-fascist movement is a violent extremist movement. And they're as active as some others in a lot of spheres in this country and overseas.
And when we talk about labeling, one of the questions I have here is, do you think white Jews should refrain from wearing kippas, skull caps, and religious jewelry so they are not easily identified?
Whoever asked that question, you caught me off guard, because I used to know the numbers in my head. That's another survey that was done 2 years ago. The number of people that have chosen to not wear Star of David, not wear a kippah, is increasing in the United States, but I can tell you, spending time in France, my Jewish friends in France don't wear any of that anymore. So do I think they should have to do that? No, I don't. We live in a country where a person should be able to wear anything they want. I mean, hopefully not being offensive to someone else, but an artifact or ornament that's religious, when you have to do that because you're concerned for your personal safety, is really unfortunate. However, there are people who are doing it because they know what it represents and they can become a target. And some people have told me, Erroll, you know, if I wear my Star of David, I'm wearing a target on my chest. And so I understand why they're doing it. But that's a sad state of affairs that we're in today. And it's just really unfortunate.
And I'm going to take the liberty with the final question. Our museum's mission is education and commemoration, and to inspire humanity through the power of truth. As a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, I made a vow a long time ago to never be a bystander and to never tolerate intolerance of any kind. So my final question is to you. If you were to offer any advice to our listeners today and beyond, what would that be?
I would say to them, be the solution that you're looking for. Be the solution we're looking for. To your point, be active. Don't be a bystander. You know, as someone from the Jewish faith, and you and myself, an African American, we certainly stand on the shoulders of giants to be where we are. And when I think about how difficult it is now I can't even imagine what it was like. I know where my ancestors were from, and I can't even imagine what that was like. So I have a duty to myself. I have a duty to my family and my friends to, when something is not right, to be the solution and be the answer to make it right. So that's what I would say. Educate yourself, make yourself aware, exercise your voice. You live in a country where we can do that. That is never going to change. Don't let it change. You know, we get what we vote for. And I'll only say that. We get what we vote for. So be that change, stay active.
Thank you. Thank you for your wisdom. And I thought it was the final question, but one more sneaked in, and I think it's a very important question. So here it comes. Can you please comment on anti-Semitism on college campuses? Ooh. Many people use anti-Israel sentiment as a cover for their anti-Semitic beliefs. An important question.
It's a very important question. It happens everywhere. I talked about Zoom bombing early in this discussion. We got Zoom bombed along with several other Jewish institutions. And we got Zoom bombed at USC. We got Zoom bombed the same day several other Jewish institutions did when COVID stay-at-home first started. You're right. I see it on the campuses. I'm glad I'm not a university administrator, because I have my own way of that. I'd want to see that handled under the guise of free speech. I think that we need to draw the lines on free speech when it comes to certain things, especially when it endangers the health and safety of other people and is threatening. So that question is right on point. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you about, I didn't even know we had fax machines at our university. We still do. We received flyers from a neo-Nazi organization last year on a fax machine at USC, came in on the fax machines. They are recruiting at college campuses. I will say that. We know that. Those are the people that they want. These extremist organizations, they want young minds. They want people who believe that they're being marginalized and victimized, and college campuses are incubators for this activity. And so I'm glad you asked that question. I do think college campuses should be more vigilant and more aggressive when it comes to anti-Semitism and, if nothing else, racism and hate and intolerance on their own campuses.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Southers. And Dr. Southers, thank you. We cannot thank you enough for sharing your insights. And I believe we've all learned so much from you this afternoon. Your expertise, it's something it's an inspiration to all of us. So thank you for joining us in your very busy schedule. We truly appreciate it. And I'd also like to say thank you to our public programs manager, Harmony Barker, for seamlessly bringing this very, very important program together. Thank you, Harmony. So before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us tomorrow morning for the next installment of our monthly series, Building Bridges. Leaders from the AAPI, Black, Jewish, and Latinx communities will discuss the merits, drawbacks, and impacts of cancel culture. You can also join us for our weekly Holocaust Survivor Talks, which will take place on all Fridays at 11 a.m. for the duration of the summer, to bring in the Sabbath and the weekend with stories of inspiration, resilience, and hope. Survivor Talks include time for questions and intergenerational dialogue. And you can find more information about our virtual events on our website, which is holocaustmuseumla.org. A recording of this program will be made available on Holocaust Museum LA's YouTube channel as of tomorrow. And Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today at no charge. So if you are enjoying our programs, please consider supporting our work, or better still, by becoming a member. Thank you again to you, Dr. Southers, and to all of you for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.